If you're a parent with a non-compliant or defiant child, one of the biggest struggles is that no matter what you do, no matter how many lessons you teach, lectures you give, no matter how many things you take away or rewards you try to bribe your child with, you can't seem to find control. You can't seem to find a way to influence them. And most parents don't have a very deep toolbox for influencing their children, especially for the long run. And it's important to remember that right now, if you have a difficult child, chances are that it's going to be a while before you actually see how you've influenced your child. You're planting seeds right now. A lot of parents want to see the proof in the pudding right now. They want to see that they taught their child a lesson, they punished their child for doing something, they gave a reward for doing chores good or something like that, and they want their child to be good for till the end of time, to go down the right path. But in reality, especially with a difficult child, what happens is you punish them or you bribe them and their behavior changes for about 2 weeks, at most a month, but it's usually around 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden they go back, you get hope and you think, all right, I did it, I changed them. And then all of a sudden 2 weeks later, they're acting the same darn way. Now, some parents who have compliant children, or if you have one compliant child and one non-compliant child, you try to you find that you can influence the compliant child, right, by bribing them or punishing them, taking things away. But the irony in that is because they're a compliant child, you probably could have just given them a stern talking to or asked them very nicely to behave differently, and they would have. Now, with the defiant child, it is so important to really keep in mind how you actually influence your children. Believe it or not, punishing them, rewarding them doesn't have much influence in the long run. Sometimes they're short term, if it works in the short term, but in the long run, it really doesn't make much difference. And so I want to make sure that parents remember how they actually influence their children. And number one is some of those lectures, those teaching. You do have to teach your child. You got to let them know what's up. You got to tell them what you expect and what your morals are, what your values are. So you do have to teach them, but don't teach them in an insane way, right? You say it over and over again. You know they don't agree. They know what you think, but you keep telling them, you keep having the same arguments over and over again, exhausting yourself. That's insanity. Stop. Teach them, know that you've planted the seeds, know that you've let them know what their expectations are, and let go for a moment. Just let it go. I know it's difficult, but you are much more influential in your teaching if you don't say it over and over again. You're much more influential when you don't become a nagging parent who every time you speak, your child hears the Charlie Brown voice, wah, wah, wah. Okay? So you do influence your child by teaching them and giving them lectures, but that can backfire if done too much or done when they're not ready to listen or hear you. Now, the second way that you influence them is boundaries. Now, most people think of boundaries as punishment and reward, and I teach a different way to look at boundaries. Boundaries are protective, they're concrete, you control the follow through, and you'll have to really get into what boundaries are here at Inspired Resolutions, you'll have to watch our boundaries video or read one of our blog articles on boundaries. But boundaries are effective. They do influence not just your children, but the people around you. When I have healthy boundaries, I'm not just modeling for my child, but I'm putting up roadblocks to certain behaviors. So that is going to influence them in the long run and tailor their behavior to an extent, but it's not everything. Okay, so teaching, boundaries. The third way that you influence your child is really important, and that's by modeling your values, your morals, your behaviors, modeling what should happen. And so a lot of parents think that they model good behavior, think that they model their morals, but they're yelling, right? And they are doing things or saying things that are kind of opposite to what they're trying to get their children to do. My the biggest example of that is parents get frustrated with their child. They yell, they scream, they might even cuss, call that child names, and then they wonder why their child doesn't respect them. And so, especially early on, one of the most influential controls that you have is what you model, okay? And they're not going to, especially during the teenage years, they're not going to behave exactly like you, but if you've modeled it and you've been consistent with it, you do influence them. The next way that you influence your children is by loving on them unconditionally. Not loving them unconditionally. I know that all you parents out there love your children, and you can tell your children that you love them. And when you are punishing them and getting mad at them and trying to set boundaries or punishments or rewards, hey, you're loving them because you're trying to protect them. But you influence them not just because they ambiguously know that you love them, but by loving on them. That's the I love yous. That's being able to have conversations, even though they're failing out of class, even though they are getting in a lot of trouble, not making all your time with them about what they're doing wrong and what's going wrong in your family, but being able to have still have loving, normal, friendly conversations with them. Loving on them is telling them what they do right, how they are good. Loving on them is joining them and walking alongside them in life, okay? A lot of people know the 5 Love Languages book, and that's kind of an example, that's kind of a simplified example of how to love on people. Loving on your child should not stop just because you're angry or just because they're acting out. You got to remember, you're the adult, okay? You are the parent. No matter what they've done, no matter how they're behaving, you got to ask yourself, who do I want to be and how do I want to act towards my child, towards my family? Not what do they deserve necessarily, but who do I want to be as a parent? How am I going to love on my child? So loving on your child is really important, and in the long run, it makes all the difference in terms of how you influence that child. If a child that's been loved on consistently and continuously rather than nagged and yelled at more than they've been loved on, in the end is going to have more of a desire to please their parents, to do the right thing. The next way that you influence your children is really important, and that's parents who are happy influence their children, okay? Your happiness shows and tells them that the way you're doing life, that the lessons you have to teach them work and are valid. And the example is, if you are, let's say that you want your child to be a moral, Christian, hardworking young man. And so every night you're telling him, hey, you've got to do your school. You've got to study. You've got to work hard. You've got to go to church. You have got to do all these things so that you become a successful, happy person. And all those lessons sound great, but if two parents who are totally miserable and seem angry all the time, are discontent with their marriage, if dad goes to work, comes home and is exhausted and talks about how terrible his job is, and if mom and dad are fighting all the time, and if Sundays are the worst day of the week because everybody's stressed out and there's fighting going on about trying to get people to church, then your child, the way that's translated to your child is, yeah, you're telling me to work hard, but look what that got you. That got you miserable. You're working a job that you hate. And by the way, I know this guy who's got a bus, surfs and smokes weed all day, and he seems way happier than you. So I think I'm going to do what works. We don't want them to think that way. You got to have your child see that you're happy in everything that you're teaching. And they might be miserable. They might be having a rough time, but you can't let their having a rough time make you miserable. It is your job to maintain and cope with these difficulties. It is your job to show that the way and the road that you're trying to get them to go down works. And the last way that you influence your child is by being consistent with all of this. None of this is influential if it isn't done day in and day out, week in, week out, year in, year out. You've got to be consistent. The consistency is what ties it all together and makes it all more influential. The fact is you don't have much influence by the time your kids are a teen. The world, their friends, teachers, media, and everything else is playing a role in their lives, is teaching them. So you've got to be that role model who puts your relationship first with them and is happy so that you can influence them in the long run. And to be honest, you might not see the seeds that you've planted grow until they're 30.